One of the most important events in all of the One Piece happened while no one was looking. This happened whilst Luffy was playing Samurai on Wano, and whilst the kings of the world were having an almost literal circle jerk at the Reverie. At the same time, the Revolutionary Army were enacting an event known as the Eight Nation Revolution. And this event is a bit buried in the minds of readers and watchers of One Piece, but it is one that has begun to completely reshape the world as we know it, with the ascension of Flame Emperor Sabo. And it may not seem like it, but this event was just as impactful as unseating an Emperor of the Sea. And we get fed a surprising amount of detail about this event. But researching for this video, I've come to realize just how criminally untalked about it is. One of the key things to understand about the success of the Eight Nation Revolution is that Monkey D. Dragon, for all of the crap and all of the jokes I give him about never doing anything, is very successfully playing the long game. And this colossal victory was calculated from events set into motion 2 years prior. And specifically, it was an operation that was planned as a result of the Paramount War. It's very easy to overlook this event because in the minds of readers and watchers of One Piece, this was a huge battle, but the only deaths were Ace, Whitebeard, and maybe Little Oars Jr. We're still not quite sure what happened to him. But what we are not shown were the tremendous casualties that were incurred by the Marines. There were 100,000 fodder Marines present at the Paramount War, and that is the bulk of the Navy. The rest of the world was left with a skeleton crew, whilst most of the Marines fought against Whitebeard with everything they had. And they won. The Marines in general, they won. But a substantial portion of those 100,000 Marines would not return from this battle. And also a substantial portion of those who did returned with permanent physical injuries that would prevent them from ever serving again. This was an immediate crisis that the world government needed to solve, because with Whitebeard gone, a fierce power vacuum had emerged, threatening global stability, and if any other Emperor of the Sea happened to choose this time to declare war on the world government, then they were finished. And so the solution to this was to enact what is known as the World Military Draft. A solution to this more immediate problem, but one that would give Dragon and the Revolutionary Army their greatest opportunity to date. The World Military Draft essentially conscripted soldiers from all world government affiliated nations in order to plug the gaping hole the Paramount War left within the Marines. It was a process of conscription that kingdoms could not oppose, with many kingdoms losing almost all capabilities of self-defense as a result. So let's say that you're the king of a world government nation, congrats, and you've got 500 loyal Kingsguard to protect your rule. But the world government has just lost tens of thousands of Marines, and now your 500 men have been conscripted to help make up for it. So in that case, I certainly hope that you've been quite the benevolent king, because if not, then you have absolutely nothing to stop a revolution or even an invasion against you. And this is the calculation that Dragon made following the Paramount War. He assembled the captains of each sector of the Revolutionary Army pre-time skip and informed his trusted associates of this plan. However, there was one problem, which is that the plan could not be enacted immediately. Here's the issue. Let's say that you're that king again. Congratulations. Your 500 Kingsguard have been taken. That's a bit sad, but you're still a world government nation. So if someone attacks you from the outside or your citizens revolt from the inside, then the world government will send you some complimentary Marines to quell that threat. So instead, what Dragon was waiting for was a point in time when the Marines would be incapacitated and powerless to act. And as it just so happens, the world government were kind enough to schedule that time in for Dragon with the Reverie, a meeting between world government nations that takes place every 4 years on the dot, and a time where the defense of the holy nation of Marijois, which is where the Reverie takes place, is paramount. Because having all of these kings in one place at one time, that would be a pretty perfect place to strike if you were some sort of global revolutionist. And given that at the time of the Paramount War, the last Reverie had been held 2 years ago, Dragon knew that 2 years from now, the bulk of the Marines would be gathered to protect the Holy Land for the next Reverie, leaving many of their nations vulnerable. And having that 2 years of planning time would also turn out to be quite integral. Revolutions don't just happen with the snap of a finger, or do they? I guess we could test it. There we go, one either did or did not happen. But generally, they require ideological seeds and a process of ideological germination. And that is why you need the sponsor of today's video, Fume. Fume is one of these things that is beyond satisfying to fidget with, and that is only a secondary function. Fume is a no smoke, no vapor, no nicotine, no battery, no significant damage to your wallet, and a non-toxic, brilliant burst of natural flavored air for your oral pleasures, very much akin to herbal teas, that are also specifically designed to break your bad habits. And unlike the One Piece power system, this is not all about raw willpower, as Fume gives you a strong ally in the battle against bad habits by giving you something else to reach out for instead. And very excitingly, Fume have launched a brand new summer flavor, being this here delicious mango, to give you a bold tropical experience like taking a relaxing vacation to an island full of women obsessed with mushrooms. You know the kind I mean, don't pretend you don't. But it is a very specific flavor, you must try it. And over 500,000 people have already made the switch to Fume as part of their habit-changing journey. So if you're ready to try it for yourself, then now is the time. And for a limited time, if you order the Journey Pack using my promo code GrandLineReview, you will get a free Fume topper, a very awesome accessory to level up your experience. Just head to tryfume.com/GrandLineReview or scan the QR code on screen to get yours today. And thank you so much to Fume, because it's their sponsorship that allows us to bring you the best fictional pirate content possible as often as possible. Definitely give it a go. For now, it's back to you, me. Thanks, me. And so during the 2-year time skip, the Revolutionary Army focused their efforts on world government nations that they saw as being particularly vulnerable. We're talking nations with notoriously corrupt royalty, as well as those who were especially harshly impacted by the heavenly tribute taxation system, which is the main source of strain on almost every world government nation. It's never been stated exactly how much this tribute is, and I believe it's calculated differently and even a bit arbitrarily from country to country, and sometimes it's a financial strain that leads to some rather inhumane decision-making. For example, King Bakori of the Sorbet Kingdom took the rather brutal step of splitting his country into 2 parts, and only having the rich part of it recognized to reduce the heavenly tribute, leaving the poor half of the nation to become an unprotected lawless zone. In that case, the heavenly tribute was calculated by population size. So the solution to that was seen to significantly purge the population. Not a very nice thing to do, said the Revolutionary Army, which identified these nations on the very edge and proceeded to dispatch their agents to plant the seeds, and ultimately left the fate of these kingdoms in the hands of their people. Something we should be clear about with the 8-Nation Revolution is that the Revolutionary Army was not directly involved in any one of these events. They mainly invested their time into swaying the hearts and minds of the citizens within these nations, with the promise that the Revolutionary Army itself would attack the Holy Land of Marijois and the world nobles. It's sort of like the principle behind Bello Betty's Devil Fruit. You can give people a rousing speech and inspire them, but ultimately it is up to them to use that inspiration. As the old saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drown its tyrannical horse monarchs in order to quench its thirst for horsey liberation, unless you provide some really solid inspiration to do so. And the vast majority of the Revolutionary Army's existence has been dedicated to slowly solving this horse problem. And in this case, after 2 years of solid planning, planting, and growing, the reverie, it was upon us. And when we as readers and watchers first learned what happened at the reverie, I remember quite a bit of confusion and just a little bit of complaining from the online One Piece fan base, because to a lot of people it just didn't make sense that Dragon did not launch a full-scale invasion of Marijois and instead just sent Sabo, Morley, Lindbergh, and Karasu. But I would say that those people share the perspective of the world government and don't quite see the bigger picture. The world government, you see, they were anticipating an attack on Marijois. Again, because he gathered all your kings and stuff there. Good place to hit if you can. But Dragon knew that, which is why his focus was primarily everywhere else. However, the reverie was still an important target, and Sabo describes the objectives of he and his hit squad of elite agents as follows. I managed to complete all of my objectives. Broadly speaking, I had 3. Firstly, to destroy the symbol of the celestial dragons in a declaration of war. Second, to free as many slaves as I possibly could and take Kuma back. And third, to venture into the land of gods and destroy their food stockpile. So for the sake of this video, we're more concerned with goals 1 and 3. The first one, destroying the symbol of the celestial dragons. That refers to a statue of their trademark hoof symbol. This is the one that they brand all of their slaves with, and it represents their dominance over the world, as if all of existence is being held down by their foot. Now, destroying the statue, it doesn't gain any immediate tangible value. However, what it is, right, it is a signal to commence against the Eight Nation Revolution. Because destroying it is very much like when Luffy ordered Soka King to shoot through the world government flag at any slobby. It is a declaration of war. And once nations around the world see that the Revolutionary Army is striking Marijois and declaring war, the idea is that that will be their signal to get them to do it as well. And something that's important to consider with this goal is also logistics. I think the Eight Nation Revolution, it might feel like a bit of a small scale event, not just because Oda has really underplayed its significance so far, but also because it's composed of nations that the Straw Hats haven't visited, so we can't quite picture them or their scale. But consider that this was a multinational effort. Getting 8 separate countries to all declare independence and revolt at the same time is a logistical nightmare. In fact, it's one of the suspected reasons why the One Piece world was flooded during the Void Century, for the purpose of making this kind of communication and collaboration incredibly difficult. And so with the flood, each individual island would become more manageable. And look, the Revolutionary Army, they're a pretty large organization, but they aren't equipped to supply communications to all of these different nations at once and coordinate everything. However, that is where the world government itself comes in, because they have built one insanely efficient communication system through the company owned by Big News Morgans and his news coups. This is the World Economic Journal, and it has mostly been used for the sake of propaganda. As if the world government wants to push a narrative to the global population, then they have the mechanism to get their message in first. Which is why Dragon decided to take advantage of that. Why bother with your own? There's an efficient one to use here. He knew that a declaration of war against the world government by doing something as outrageous as destroying the hoof statue would be news that is far, far too big to ignore. The moment it happened, the news crews would be sent out as soon as they possibly could, and each participating country in the Eight Nation Revolution would receive the signal to commence at approximately the same time. It's quite a clever move, using the superior infrastructure of your enemies to carry your message. As I often say, the world government is its own worst enemy, and it creates most of its own problems. And Dragon here is taking full advantage of that. But let's move on to goal number 3, because this one isn't immediately apparent, but it is very important to the success of the Eight Nation Revolution, which was destroying the food stockpiles at Marijois. At the moment, Dragon's plan is to put all of the world nobles into a state of famine, which is a very poetic punishment for them. But Dragon, he's not just destroying existing foods, he's also cutting off future food and resources. By simultaneously removing 8 nations, Dragon has cut the world government off from 8 food industries, as well as 8 sources of heavenly tribute, which makes their already problematic task of restocking Marijois that much more difficult, as they have less raw produce coming in, as well as less financial resources to buy more food from elsewhere. And although this wasn't a stated goal, there was also one more factor that was key for this revolution to succeed, and that was to chastise the Marine Admirals. At any given time, these 3 men are referred to as the greatest military power, and it's because that is very true. If the Marines were to lose their admirals, then they would be able to be toppled by any given Emperor of the Sea. And the brilliance of launching this hit squad on Marijois is that it tied down 2 Marine Admirals at the same time. Ryukugyu and Fujitora were both present during the reverie, which is despite Fujitora being warned by Sakazuki not to be there, and so these 2 were tapped to defend the Holy Land and the world nobles from Sabo, Morley, Karasu, and Lindbergh. And in any other circumstances, 2 admirals would brutally dismantle this attack in a matter of seconds. However, due to the battleground, neither of them could use anywhere near their full power. Fujitora has a gravity-related devil fruit, which if he were to use, would cause collateral damage affecting the world nobles and their infrastructure, and Ryukugyu's Forest Logia isn't that much better, because its main advantage is the reckless disregard for the existing environment around it, which in this case is what he has been charged with protecting. And also you got to bear in mind that world nobles, they are not regular civilians. If even a single world noble, if a single world noble were to be injured, then you'd better believe that even a Marine Admiral would be held very responsible for letting it happen. Whether that be imprisonment or even execution, it could be, given that it would be a crime against a god. Whatever it is, it's not good. So Ryukugyu and Fujitora needed to be so extraordinarily careful during the conflict, and following the conflict, they would have remained tied up as well, as there is no way the world nobles would have risked deploying their admirals elsewhere if they still feared that they could be under attack. So this maneuver took 2 admirals out of the picture. Very important, because even one of them could stop the revolution of an entire nation. There is still Kizaru floating around somewhere, but he can't be everywhere at once. So undefeatable as he may be, even a man who can move at light speed would not be fast enough to prevent the sheer amount of damage that was about to be done here. So, to recap, the Marines don't have the forces required to prevent a revolution. The individual kingdoms do not have armies sizable enough to control the public because they've mostly been conscripted into the Marines. The royalty of the kingdoms themselves aren't even there on their islands because they're at the Reverie, and public dissatisfaction with its current government in all of these nations is what I like to call the pitchfork point. And so our table is set and it is time for a lovely revolutionary dinner. Following the declaration of war at Marijois, a total of 12 nations decided to revolt. And at the time of this recording, we only know 3 of them. The first was the Kingdom of Lelucia, led by King Seki. The second was the Tajin Kingdom, ruled by Queen Mororodon. And the third is the Aegis Kingdom, overseen by King T IV. The Tajin Kingdom is essentially the One Piece world's equivalent of Morocco, and Aegis is the United Kingdom. And this is unconfirmed, but I think it's very possible that following this trend, other nations that may have revolted include the Ballywood Kingdom, ruled over by Hamburger, the Shishino Kingdom, controlled by King Tacos, the Roshuan Kingdom, led by King Beer VI, the Nagagutsu Kingdom, managed by Furari, and so on. Essentially, there's a whole list of these miscellaneous kingdoms that Oda invented just for the Reverie. About 16 all in all, and they're all based on real-world places. So I think it's a safe bet to say that Oda made these kingdoms to give the Revolutionary Army tangible targets. However, of the 12 kingdoms that revolted, only 8 of them were successful, hence why it's not called the 12-Nation Revolution, which would have been much nicer. And we don't know what caused the failure of the other 4 nations. It could be that the Marines did have just enough forces to stop a select amount, or the administrators of those kingdoms had a superior defense strategy, or even poor planning by the civilian revolutionaries. Either way, 8 nations, that was considered to be quite a huge success, as nothing of this scale had been pulled off since the Void Century at the very least. And you might be thinking, man, on the internet, that's wonderful, but what is the Revolutionary Army itself doing during this time? If not helping the nations directly or assisting Sabo's team at Marijois? Well, look, they weren't just sitting around doing nothing. The army itself was deployed to an assortment of strategic positions around the world with the goal of attacking all inbound cargo ships to Marijois in order to sever their current supply line, an act that they would normally not be able to achieve. But with the Reverie occurring, 2 admirals of fist fighting, and 12 nations in open rebellion, those cargo ships were an afterthought and they were left completely unprotected. And this was such a success that even after the Reverie concluded, Fleet Admiral Sakazuki admitted that they couldn't do anything about the successful revolutions or the cargo issues because they did not have the soldiers available to deploy. But ironically as ever, that is the fault of the world government, as the kings during the Reverie came to the agreement to cease the warlord system. And so the vast majority of Marine sources had to be immediately invested in an attempt to capture the remaining 7 warlords, a feat which has been thus far fairly unsuccessful. But of the 8 nations that did succeed in their revolutions, at least one of them would have quite a tragic ending. As a result of its rebellion, the Lucia Kingdom was targeted by Imu as a test case for his use of the ancient weapon Uranus, and so the entire island was wiped out of existence, which is quite a bit of victory for the Revolutionary Army, convincing this island to rebel for its best interests, and then having that effort be the reason why almost the entire civilization was killed. But it will be very interesting to see how the world government tries to explain these events in the history books, because it is called the 8-Nation Revolution. However, if Lelucia never existed, then we only have a 7-Nation Revolution. And look, good news is we've still got 7 countries under new leadership, but the bad news is that the world government still has 170 plus allied nations under its banner. So this battle was a victory, but the war, it has only just begun. But slightly more good news, it does look like those 7 nations are uniting under a slightly different banner. As the director of Naval Bureau of Investigation Kurouma mentions, Sabo is currently believed by the public to be the one responsible for the attempted murder of St. Charles, the murder of King Cobra, and the kidnapping of Princess Vivi. So there is now a massive conspiracy theory out there connecting everything to Sabo, which has led to Sabo being declared as the Flame Emperor, and he is currently the metaphorical, and when he turns into fire, a quite literal flame of the revolution, now said to have even more influence than Dragon himself. So the Revolutionary Army is slowly building a consolidated force. It's probably not the one that they predicted it would be, but this is the direction that the winds have blown, and the hope from here is that more and more nations see that liberation is possible, and that this snowball eventually becomes too big for even the world government to stop. And thank you so much to Fume again for sponsoring this video, and definitely check them out through the link in the description.